So let's look at the weighted average cost of capital formula. First things are first, this is the way we'd write it. Okay, the weighted average cost of capital is equal to this expression that you see there. Okay, now let's be mindful that it doesn't really look very user-friendly at this point, but it's just a matter of intuitively understanding what it means. So first thing as our first, again, the two components that you see there, let me change that so it's going to be easier to look at this. The two components that you see there, R sub D and R sub E, are the cost of debt and the cost of equity respectively. Okay, so we know that the weighted average cost of capital has to be like an average, right, of the cost of the funds that we raise for purposes of investing in our company. Now, let's assume, as just to continue with my previous numbers, that this is 20% and 10%. These are the compensations that your providers of funds require as a compensation, again, for the risk that they bear. All right, then we have the weights, right? Because the cost of capital is a weighted average of the cost of funding. What these weights really mean is that, well, if you are, say, raising half of the money from one source, the other half from the other source, then automatically your weights would be 50%, right? 50% coming from debt, 50% coming from equity. Okay, but this is not always the case, of course, right? The weights are a function of how you are in fact raising your funds. So this weight is really, in this case, the result of taking D. D is a debt. Now, debt is all interest-bearing debt, and I'm not talking about net debt, right? So we're not subtracting any cash or any excess liquidity that we have at our disposal. This is the amount of debt that we have in our capital structure in our company, and that debt is divided by all of the funds that are raised. Now, all the funds that are raised are, again, all interest-bearing debt, and of course the funds that come from equity. Okay, this is the weight that we're going to use. So if you have raised, excuse me, if you have raised, let's say, 30 from debt and 70 from equity, then this would become debt is 30 divided by what was the total of all the funds that were raised? 30 plus 70, right? That's 100. So the weight of debt is 30%, and it's expressed as 0.3. Okay. Same thing for the weight of equity. The weight of equity would be what portion of all the funds that you raised is coming from equity. All right. Now, the only component that's left is a 1 minus T. What does this 1 minus T mean? T is the corporate tax rate. And if you're talking about the case of Rwanda, for example, the average corporate tax rate is around 30%, right? So what does that mean? It means that if in general, we are able to deduct our interest expenses from our taxes. We saw this in accounting, correct? So what does that mean? It means that, say, if your cost of debt, let me change this. If your cost of debt, say, is 10%. What is this doing? What are we doing when we multiply this cost of debt times y minus t? We're taking the 10% and we're multiplying times 1 minus, what is it, the corporate tax rate that we said? It was 30%, right? 0.3. What does that become? It becomes 7%. What we're saying is that even though your nominal cost of debt is 10%, because those interest payments that you're going to pay on that debt are going to save you in the form of taxes, then ultimately you really end up only paying an effective cost of debt of only 7%. So this 1 minus t that you see here is a recognition that that there's a tax shield that exists in many countries. If your country does not have any corporate taxes, then of course the t will become 0, and there's no effect. But in the countries that do allow the tax deductibility of interest, that has to be incorporated into the weighted average cost of capital, because what effectively is happening is that the government is in a way subsidizing you and allowing you to reduce your cost of debt. Okay. So I hope it's clear that what this estimation does is it does two things. It finds a weighted average cost of capital by just finding the average, but weighted, right, of your cost of debt and your cost of equity. And by the way, if you have cost of debt and cost of special kind of debt, if you have common stock in the form of equity or maybe preferred stock, in other words, if you have various forms of debt and equity. Let's suppose that it is, instead of borrowing from just a single debt source, you have two different debt sources with two different costs. And instead of raising funds from a single equity source, you have two types of shareholders. Then your weighted average cost of capital formula becomes, instead of having two components, it will become four, right? So in other words, this is an average of all the sources of funds that you have, right? This is the average cost of all the sources of funds. If you have 5 different funds with 5 different costs, then you will have 5 components as your WACC. That's the first thing. The second thing is to recognize that the T here is to recognize the effect of the tax shield on our cost of funding. Notice that as managers, what you try to do is minimize your cost of capital. Why do you want to minimize your cost of capital? Because if you minimize your cost of capital, then you effectively are, remember, value is just the free cash flows divided by the WACC, right? If you minimize your cost of capital, this is as small as it can be, what you're doing is maximizing your company's value. Okay. Just one other thing about this WACC formula. The weights that we use here are not historical weights. What should they be? Since the WACC is going to be discounting future cash flows, notice we just here, then the WACC should reflect the weights that you expect to see in the future. And what that means is that if you have an optimal capital structure in mind, in other words, if you tell me today we have 30% debt, 70% equity, but I think that the optimal level for us, the one that minimizes my WACC, is not 30-70, it should be 40-60. If that's your optimal capital structure, if that's the one that you're going to try to converge to, then you should use 40 and 60 in your WACC estimation. Why? Because the WACC is discounting future cash flows. And what does the future look like? Does it look like the way you are today at 30-70? Or does it look like the optimal that you're trying to reach, which is 40-60? One would say it should be 40-60. Okay. So I hope that's clear. Let me go on and remind you of one other thing. The cost of debt is usually the borrowing cost that we have, and we know that if you're borrowing from a financial institution, we know what your borrowing costs are. If you issue bonds, then the cost will be the yield to maturity of the bonds. But the cost of equity, how do we find the cost of equity? Let me just remind you, the cost of equity comes from the SML or capital asset pricing model. So this is now a known expression, right? Just make sure that we have this here. Okay, so you may remember that the components that we need to find R sub E in order to put it in our WACC estimation is the risk-free rate, right? The measure of systematic risk for the company and the price of risk. Okay. In the next chat, we'll do an application and exercise where we actually find the weighted average cost of capital.